Guns dominated this conversation today, both in Albany as well as our nation's capital. The issue is, where do we go from here? Tonight, we will have my interview with one of the major forces against gun control in America. Larry Pratt will join us. He's the executive director of Gun Owners of America. Larry doesn't believe that even armor-piercing bullets ought to be illegal. Trust me, you'll want to see and hear our conversation. And then later, Governor Cuomo makes his State of the State address today. We'll tell you what he had to say, not just about guns. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thanks so much for joining us this Wednesday evening, January 9th. Now, we'll get into guns, but I want to tell you we're also going to be talking about issues, for example, a major lawsuit dealing with Indian Point, the controversial nuclear power plant. Richard Brodsky will join us. He'll tell about the suit that he filed and why it's such an important decision and what it could mean for that power plant going forward. And baseball, Hall of Fame today, with arguably the most prolific class since the very first class that went into the Hall of Fame, and yet not one person got in. We'll talk about all those things. But as I said right off the top, guns, the dominant issue today, and the Newtown shooting, it has driven a renewed conversation on gun control. Vice President Joe Biden, he's been tapped by the White House, as you know, to spearhead a national response. And today he told reporters that the president is exploring the possibility of using an executive order on gun control if Congress does not come through. And in the meantime, Biden, he's bringing all sides to the table for this conversation. Today, he sat down with victims groups as well as gun control activists. He'll also be sitting down with gun rights advocates tomorrow, including the NRA. Clearly, the White House, they got a decision to make here, and they got to do this thing sooner than later. We know the national consciousness is really 4 to 5 weeks, and then the public moves on to something else, and we're about a month since the tragedy in Newtown. So here's the decision they have to make. Will they go big with far-reaching proposals to really change guns and gun control in this country, or do they want to take a smaller approach with specific, albeit more enactable changes? That decision will likely be impacted not just from those who want gun control, but also, and probably also most importantly, from the response they're going to get from the gun rights community, because while they don't speak for most Americans, they have been very successful thus far at dictating the terms of the debate. So before we bring in our panel, we decided to bring in a prominent gun proponent for some clarity on where he stands on this issue. And I'm going to tell you right now, over the years, I've had shouting matches with this guest. I've turned off his microphone. I've thrown him off the set here. We agree on next to nothing. But I decided, rather than all the heat here, what about a little light tonight? I thought, and you'll be your own judge, it would be best to let the man speak, to let our guests answer some of the most basic questions about the terms of this debate. And believe it or not, I think I bit my tongue for most of it. But you be the judge. Here now, my interview with Larry Pratt. He's the executive director of the Gun Owners of America, and it's one of the nation's preeminent Second Amendment organizations. It's got 300,000 members here in their national organization. Take a listen. You probably saw the press conference with Wayne LaPierre, the executive vice president of the NRA, when he said the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and the logic of that means that we should make it possible for those who work at schools who qualify for a concealed carry permit, a principal, a janitor, a teacher, to be able to carry a concealed firearm, concealed so there's the element of surprise in case some nut job tries to repeat Newtown. They would find they don't know where effective defense might be coming from.
Let's stay with where guns should be allowed. And you just mentioned in schools, and you said for people who would qualify. You mentioned teachers. Let's extend it. What about the lunch lady? Do you think any adult that can qualify should carry a firearm in school?
Yeah, that's where I was going, a visiting parent. If they are qualified for a concealed carry, then they should be welcome to do so. Also, we've got to take away the monopoly of force that we have ended up giving to the monsters that think it's really neat to kill a whole bunch of people, keeping in mind that all of our mass murders for the last 20 years that we've been playing with these free zones, gun-free zones, have occurred in gun-free zones.
Well, let me stay with that because you mentioned the adults. So we have seniors in this in high schools across America that are 18 years of age that qualifies them as adults. Do you think we should let students, if they're 18, bring guns to school, concealed weapons?
There aren't too many states that allow concealed carry at the age of 18. But yes, if they're going to be allowed to carry at Walmart or the library, I don't think we can argue correctly or sensibly or rationally that somehow the environment of the school is going to set them off and they're going to become dangerous where they're not dangerous anywhere else.
Let's go beyond schools. How about places of worship? Or for that matter, how about even bars? As we've seen in certain states, people can carry a concealed weapon, not just when they're there for prayer, but literally when they're having a drink or two or three. Do you have a problem in either scenario with people legally, assuming they fit the requirements, having concealed weapons in churches or bars?
Well, most states have now, not all, have gotten rid of the prohibition on concealed firearms in churches. And it's a good thing they have in Colorado because a mass murder was averted when a guy with 3 guns, 1,000 rounds of ammunition, went into the New Life Church in Colorado Springs. So I think it's a very good idea for people to be able to protect themselves wherever they are.
Let me talk about what the Vice President's proposal, and while it's not formal yet, we already have an idea, Larry, some of the items that he's going to be putting forward, including background checks and a universal background check for a firearm buyer. Do you have any problems with that?
You know, here we are talking about how much more difficult we're going to make it for the good guy to get a gun when bad guys didn't have problems getting guns when guns were banned in Washington, D.C. or in Chicago. So we're not expecting any progress to be made by further gun controls. We really think the debate needs to move in the direction of where else should we be enabling people to carry their concealed firearms.
But I'm just trying to get a sense, because I don't know about if you did one internally with your organization, but I know the NRA polled their membership, and between 2/3 and 3/4 of their members didn't have a problem with background checks to be able to buy a weapon. The thinking being, if I've done nothing wrong, I've got nothing to worry about. To have a database isn't going to infringe my rights to buy a gun. Do you think, at least in your group, that most people would have a problem with the background check?
I suspect they might, and for the following reason. The very government that's going to presume to look over my shoulder as to whether I'm a qualified buyer of a firearm is the very government under Fast and Furious that was enabling the sale of rifles like AR-15s, these kinds of semi-automatic firearms that Senator Feinstein would like to ban, making sure that those got into the hands of the Mexican cartel. So I think the government needs to clean up its own act before it presumes to be looking over our shoulder. We need to be looking over their shoulder a whole lot more closely.
So I presume at a gun show you don't believe that we now need to have background checks for somebody wanting to purchase, for example, at a gun show?
No, we're not going to solve our crime problem by making more restrictions go down on the books.
What about people on terror watch lists, or somebody that's got a restraining order against them, or somebody that is clinically diagnosed with a serious mental illness, schizophrenia, etc.? If we don't have a background check, Larry, how do you keep guns out of their hands? How do you keep somebody from walking to a gun show and walking out when they're a threat to their spouse, or in this case, to the United States of America if they're on a terror watch list?
If a person is truly a threat to self or others, they shouldn't be out walking around loose. We've deinstitutionalized the mentally ill over the last 40 years, and now we get faced with dealing with problems like this. It's not the problem of gun owners who didn't get a background check. It's the problem of authorities who've said, we want dangerous people out on the streets instead of being institutionalized. We object to that.
So somebody with a restraining order, just so everybody's clear, they should be able to walk in to a gun show and walk out with a gun?
If we're going to allow them to be walking around on the streets with a restraining order on them, we're not really serious, because we know how much good restraining orders do. The only way they will stop, say, a violent spouse is for the wife to have a gun herself and be able to use it to save her own life. We're not going to be saved by restraining orders.
Okay, what about somebody, a felon, across this country every day? We have thousands of people that are released from prison, convicted felons who do their time and they're released. Should they be eligible to be able to purchase a firearm? And if they're not, and we don't have a background check, how do we make sure they don't get them?
Well, they should be eligible, particularly when we consider that there are a few states already that restore the rights of a felon who, after getting out of jail, has cleaned up his act. And the idea that we would forever disable them from enjoying their civil rights when, if they can, they've, after, say, 5 years, kept themselves out of jail, then they should be good to go. And to keep the big scarlet letter on the felon for the rest of his life, we think, is not the way it should be done in America. That is not due process.
Well, James Holmes, God forbid the Aurora shooter's ever released from prison, should he ever be able to own a firearm?
Well, let's suggest that we never let him out of prison. Let's suggest that we shouldn't even be paying to put him in jail. We should be paying to bury him.
It gets tricky when we talk about the terror watch list, for example. 247 people on the government's terror watch list, suspects, not yet someone that they could prove and make a case on. 247 people on the terror watch list purchased guns, Larry, 2 years ago. That doesn't give you pause to say they shouldn't just be able to walk in and walk out of a store with a gun? If we know them to be a suspect to harm the nation.
Has not made its case against them and put them in jail and or thrown them out of the country, as the case may be. We've got to get away from this Nazi and this Soviet idea that it's enough for some professional to make an accusation, a diagnosis, and away we go. We're off on our way to jail, and who knows after that. This is America. Due process needs to be put back in the central important place where it was historically. And the more we make it, let's just do away with the whole Bill of Rights, and then the police can be much more efficient.
Well, just explain a little bit more what you see the Nazi way. Again, clarify your reservation here if law enforcement decides someone's a threat to the nation?
Under Nazi Germany, under Soviet Russia, medicine became a political tool, and it was used against dissidents. They were declared insane. Naturally, they didn't have anything resembling what we would call a trial. They were just diagnosed and carted off. That's the danger that we are slipping toward. I'm not saying that we're there, but this whole idea that you can just do away with people's rights without a trial, without the adversarial procedure, without the ability to bring in contravening witnesses, that's where we've been going, and that's got to stop.
Let me ask you now about the type of guns and that you believe should or maybe shouldn't be available in the marketplace. Let's start with armor-piercing bullets. Can you give a compelling rationale why those should be made available to the general public?
Well, we still don't have a good definition of armor-piercing bullets. If you're going to ban armor-piercing bullets, you're going to ban anything basically that's fired out of a rifle. Are you ready to do that?
Well, I want to go to what both law enforcement is saying. Overwhelmingly, all the major law enforcement agencies in this country, including the Fraternal Order of Police, etc., they want to ban semi-automatic weapons. And rather than getting into a debate about what the definition should or shouldn't be, they've also made the point that these extended clips, they really aren't designed for the general public. And I want to read a quote here from retired General Stanley McChrystal. Certainly not anyone I think people would connote with a bleeding heart. He said, quote, "I spent a career carrying typically either an M16 or an M4 carbine. That's what our soldiers ought to carry. I personally don't think there's any need for that kind of weaponry on the streets, and particularly around the schools in America." Does the general have a point, Larry?
General doesn't know what he's talking about. The general apparently is ignorant of Korean merchants who defended their lives and their property during the LA riots when the police were days away from showing up at the scene. They used AR-15 type firearms with big magazines to fight off the mob that were threatening them and their property. Same thing after Katrina. Rifles with large magazines were the only effective way, in the absence of police, to keep the mobs from overcoming neighborhoods and stores. And to say that there's no legitimate reason or use for that kind of magazine and firearm is just historically ignorant.
There was a recent gun buyback in LA. There's been a lot, obviously, around the nation since Newtown. But in this gun buyback, it was interesting, Larry, the kind of weapons that were resold back to the authorities, including 75 assault weapons, including among them what law enforcement labeled as street sweepers. They also had 2 bazookas. And give me, from your perspective, where is the line in terms of weaponry that really should not be in the public's hands? It should be relegated to a military or law enforcement, but not the general public.
Well, the founders of the Republic gave us a lot of guidance. Not only did they provide the Second Amendment to recognize the God-given right we have to keep and carry arms, but they dealt with what kind of arms the average soldier was expected to have personally. They were required under federal militia law of 1796 to have their own military rifle, so that where they called up, they'd have their own rifle to bring with them.
Do you believe the Founding Fathers intended that as weaponry advanced, things like a street sweeper, or for that matter, even a bazooka, should be in public hands, not in the advanced state of this country here, for example, the military or law enforcement, things we didn't really have at the founding of our nation?
I'm sure they would be as supportive of that as they would be us using our present Skype technology, television technology, internet technology, all of these things that have developed long after the First Amendment was first written.
Well, let's get to the role of, if not the role of the government, the frustration that you're starting to hear, even though there hasn't been any meaningful legislation even offered yet, let alone enacted upon in Washington, but the fear among some gun rights groups that there will be a major overstep by the government. I'm sure you've seen this clip here. Most of our audience, I'm sure, has as well. This from Alex Jones, not from your organization, but from another gun rights group who was recently on CNN, and he made it very pointed and very clear where he said some of the consequences would be if such legislation went through. Take a listen.
Hitler took the guns. Stalin took the guns. Mao took the guns. Fidel Castro took the guns. Hugo Chavez took the guns. And I'm here to tell you, 1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms. Doesn't matter how many lemmings you get out there on the street begging for them to have their guns taken. We will not relinquish them. Do you understand? That's why you're going to fail, and the establishment knows no matter how much propaganda, the Republic will rise again when you attempt to take our guns.
What was your reaction when you heard what Mr. Jones had to say there?
Well, Mr. Jones seemed to be addressing particularly the idea that the government might at some point try to confiscate. And I think if that were ever to take place, that you would face probably a lot of soldiers and police officers that would not want to have any part of that.
Well, let me be more specific. Forgetting the confiscating for a moment, and again, that would be a decree from the government, but beyond that, if there are restrictions on the rights of gun owners, we're not suggesting that there'd be a call to arms for the general public to take up arms, whether it be against law enforcement or government, right? I just want to let our audience get a point of clarification here.
No, and nor are we in a position to issue a call to arms. But I think the government should learn from the experience of King George that you can push your tyranny to the point that you're perceived as having no legitimacy left whatsoever. And then you're regarded as a common bandit. And that's the danger I think the government needs to learn from the example of tyrants in the past.
All right, but make it clear, where and when do you think we reach that point? Restrictions, is that reaching that point? Give me a little more clarity.
I have no idea where that point might be. I'm not sure anybody does or can declare where it is. But I'm just saying, I think the government officials that are talking about more and more restrictions, or even as Senator Feinstein would like to confiscate guns, really better think that through, because history has a lot to teach about that, particularly in the English-speaking world.
Larry Pratt, Gun Owners of America, very illuminating. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Now, before anyone at home dismisses Larry as some rank crackpot here, understand that he is one of the leading voices for gun rights groups in his particular organization with more than 300,000 members, but not too dissimilar from other groups as well who believe what you just heard. Safe to say, I didn't and don't agree with a single syllable of what he did, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to hear what one side in this country believes the line should or shouldn't be as it relates to the discussion we're having now as it relates to reform. I'm going to bring in our panel after this break, so please stay with us.